The entire showroom went quiet the moment the fire-scorched piano was wheeled through the front doors of Hargrove Concert Hall. Two stagehands stopped mid-step. A custodian leaned on his mop and stared. The once magnificent Steinway Grand looked like something pulled from the aftermath of a building collapse. Its ivory keys melted and blackened. The mahogany cabinet split down the center like a wound that refused to close. Smoke damage had turned the gold lettering on the fallboard into an unreadable smear. And standing behind it, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, Leonard Aldridge, one of the most powerful arts patrons on the eastern seaboard, watched as the master restorer she had flown in from Vienna delivered his verdict without hesitation. Beyond saving, the soundboard was destroyed. The cast iron plate had warped from the heat. Even the pin block, the hidden skeleton holding every string in tension, had cracked in ways that made structural recovery impossible. He recommended she preserve whatever fragments she could and commission a replica. A beautiful replica, he emphasized. One that would honor the original. Catherine didn't move. She didn't argue. She just stood there looking at the ruined instrument the way someone looks at a photograph of a person they will never see again. Then, from the far side of the loading dock, a man in a faded work jacket with sawdust on his sleeves set down a cup of gas station coffee and said 5 words that nobody in the room expected. "I know how to save it." Nobody in the room expected. "I know how to save it." Nobody believed him either. If you have ever been told your dream was impossible, if you have ever been dismissed before anyone bothered to learn your name, take a moment to like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to Kindest Tales for more stories that prove the world still has room for miracles wrapped in ordinary clothes. Garrett Hollis never planned on becoming invisible. At 43 years old, the widowed father of a 12-year-old daughter named Sophie had spent 2 decades building and restoring instruments in a workshop so small you could hear the rain hitting every corner of the roof at the same time. His shop sat on a gravel road outside Decatur, Illinois, sandwiched between a farm supply store and a barber shop that had been closed since 2019. There was no sign on the building, no website, no social media presence. Just a steel door with a handwritten note taped to the glass that read Hollis Restorations by appointment. Most people drove past it without noticing. That was fine with Garrett. He did not need the world to notice. He just needed enough work to keep the lights on and enough time to pick Sophie up from school by 3:15 every afternoon. But it had not always been this way. A decade earlier, Garrett was considered one of the most promising acoustic engineers in the American piano industry. He studied at the Juilliard School's piano technology program, before apprenticing under a German master craftsman in Hamburg for 3 years. He understood soundboard physics the way a surgeon understands anatomy. His ear could detect a quarter-tone deviation in string tension that most digital tuners missed entirely. By his early 30s, he was consulting for concert halls, private collectors, and universities across the Midwest, earning a reputation as the person you called when nobody else could solve the problem. Then his wife Diane got sick. It started with headaches she blamed on stress, then fatigue that would not go away no matter how much she slept. By the time the diagnosis came, an aggressive glioblastoma that had already begun pressing against the language centers of her brain, the doctors spoke in terms of months, not years. Garrett shut down everything. He canceled contracts, returned deposits, stopped answering calls from clients who still needed him. For 11 months, he sat beside Diane in a hospital room in Springfield while Sophie, barely 4 years old, stayed with Diane's mother 2 hours away. He read to Diane when she could still listen. He held her hand when words stopped making sense to either of them. And when she died on a Tuesday morning in March while snow fell outside the hospital window, Garrett drove home, walked into his empty workshop, sat down on the floor beside an unfinished piano restoration he never completed, and did not move for a very long time. The grief did not break him all at once. It dismantled him in stages. First the ambition went. Then the confidence. Then the belief that his talent mattered at all in a world that had taken the only person who ever made him feel like his work meant something beyond wood and wire. Medical bills consumed their savings. The consulting business collapsed. His reputation faded the way sound fades in a room after the last note is played. Slowly, then all at once, until nobody remembered it was ever there. The only thing Garrett refused to let go of was Sophie, so he downsized. He moved into the small workshop, converting the back storage room into a living space barely large enough for 2 beds and a hot plate. He took whatever repair jobs walked through the door: church organs with stuck keys, school band instruments dented by careless teenagers, the occasional upright piano dragged in by someone who found it on the side of the road. Work that paid little and demanded less. Every evening, after Sophie finished her homework at the workbench beside him, Garrett would stay up late restoring instruments nobody else wanted. Warped violins, water-damaged cellos, a harmonium from 1923 that a farmer found in his barn he could not bring himself to throw away. Garrett rebuilt them all with the same meticulous care he once gave to concert grands worth 6 figures. Not because anyone was watching, because the work itself was the only thing that still made sense. Sophie never complained about the small space or the lack of things other kids had. She learned to hand her father tools before he asked for them. She fell asleep most nights to the sound of him sanding wood or adjusting felt hammers under a single overhead light. And she understood, even at 12, that her father carried a sadness he never talked about but could not quite put down. Meanwhile, 1,200 miles east, Leonard Aldridge sat at the center of a world Garrett Hollis could not have imagined. At 51 years old, Catherine ran the Aldridge Arts Foundation, a nonprofit her father, concert pianist and composer Leonard Aldridge, established before his death 7 years earlier. Leonard was a legend, not just for his technical brilliance but for his belief that music belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. He spent his final years touring small towns and rural communities, performing free concerts in high school gymnasiums, church basements, and public parks. He played for people who had never heard a live piano in their lives, and the instrument he always brought with him was the same one: a custom 1961 Steinway Model D that he had modified himself over decades, adjusting the hammer voicing, reshaping the bridge caps, and installing a custom soundboard made from alpine spruce he personally selected during a trip to Austria in 1979. That piano was not just an instrument. It was Leonard's voice. His philosophy made physical. Every modification reflected a conversation he had been having with music for over 50 years. When Leonard died, the piano became the foundation's most treasured possession. Catherine kept it in a climate-controlled vault inside Hargrove Concert Hall in Philadelphia. She allowed it to be played only during the annual Leonard Aldridge Memorial Concert, a sold-out event that raised millions for music education in underserved communities. Then, 7 months ago, a fire broke out in the storage wing of Hargrove Hall during an electrical failure. The suppression system activated too late. By the time firefighters arrived, the vault had reached temperatures exceeding 800 degrees. The piano survived in the loosest possible sense of the word. It was still recognizable as a piano, but everything that made it Leonard's, the custom soundboard, the hand-voiced hammers, the decades of careful modification, had been destroyed or severely compromised. Catherine spent 4 months and over $200,000 consulting the best piano restorers in the world. She flew in specialists from Vienna, Tokyo, and London. Every single one reached the same conclusion: the instrument was structurally unsalvageable. The custom modifications Leonard made were undocumented and irreproducible. Even if the body could somehow be rebuilt, the sound, the specific, unmistakable voice Leonard spent a lifetime creating, was gone forever. For Catherine, it felt less like losing a piano and more like losing her father a second time. The last recording of his final concert played on a loop in her office most afternoons while she stared out the window at a city that never stopped moving, wondering how a woman who controlled a foundation worth $300 million could feel so completely powerless. The day Garrett Hollis spoke up was an accident of geography. He had been in Philadelphia delivering a restored church organ to a Baptist congregation in Germantown. A friend who worked as a custodian at Hargrove Hall mentioned offhandedly that some rich woman had a ruined piano she was trying to fix, and that all the big names had already given up. Garrett had no intention of getting involved. He had a daughter waiting at home, a truck with a questionable transmission, and enough work in his shop to keep him busy through winter. But something made him stop by the loading dock that afternoon. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the part of him that still ached for a challenge worthy of what he used to be. Whatever it was, when he saw the piano, he did not see destruction. He saw a puzzle. And Garrett Hollis had always been dangerously good at puzzles. His offer was met with polite skepticism at best. Catherine's team ran a background check that afternoon and found exactly what they expected: a small-town repairman with no online presence, no major clients, and a 10-year gap in his professional history that suggested either retirement or irrelevance. One of Catherine's advisors, a silver-haired man named Philip who managed the foundation's arts acquisitions, openly discouraged her from wasting time. He called Garrett a hobbyist, said the project needed a world-class facility, not a one-man garage in central Illinois. But Catherine had watched Garrett's face when he looked at the piano. She had seen dozens of experts examine the instrument over the past 4 months. They all looked at it the same way, with clinical detachment, cataloging damage the way an insurance adjuster photographs a car wreck. Garrett looked at it differently. He moved slowly. He pressed his fingertips against the cracked soundboard and closed his eyes. He tapped the cast iron plate with his knuckle and tilted his head, listening for something nobody else thought to listen for. He crouched beneath the frame and studied the underside for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word. When he finally stood up, he did not promise perfection. He said the piano had memory. That wood and metal, if treated carefully, retained echoes of what they once were. He said the soundboard was damaged but not dead. The grain pattern was still readable. The custom modifications Leonard made left physical traces: compression marks, shaping grooves, adhesive residue that could serve as a blueprint if someone was patient enough to decode them. Nobody in the room fully understood what he meant, but Catherine understood the look in his eyes. It was the same look her father had whenever he sat down at a piano and the rest of the world disappeared. Against every recommendation, she gave Garrett the project. The piano was transported to Decatur in a climate-controlled truck that cost more per mile than Garrett earned in a week. His workshop was cleared of every other project. Sophie helped him build a custom restoration cradle from lumber they bought at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. Then the work began. Garrett started by spending 2 full weeks simply studying the instrument. He did not pick up a single tool. He photographed every crack, every char mark, every warped pin. He made detailed drawings of the soundboard grain patterns, mapping the direction and density of the wood fibers the way a geologist maps sediment layers. He read every published article about Leonard Aldridge's modifications. He tracked down a retired piano technician in Cincinnati named Walter, who had worked with Leonard briefly in the 1990s, and spent an entire weekend on the phone with him, taking notes in a composition book that eventually filled 60 pages. Sophie watched all of this with quiet fascination. She had seen her father restore instruments before, but never like this. He moved with a focus she had not witnessed since she was very young, before the sadness settled into his shoulders and never quite left. One evening, about 3 weeks into the project, Sophie sat cross-legged on the workshop floor doing math homework, while Garrett carefully removed what remained of the original soundboard. She looked up and asked him why this piano mattered so much. Garrett set down his tools and thought for a long moment before answering. "Because somebody built this with love," he said, "and when you build something with love, it does not just disappear because the world breaks it. It hides. And if you are patient enough and quiet enough, you can find it again." Sophie looked at him for a moment, then went back to her homework. But she smiled while she did. The restoration consumed 5 months. Garrett worked on the piano every day from 7 in the morning until midnight, pausing only to feed Sophie, help with homework, and drive her to school. He sourced alpine spruce from the same Austrian region Leonard used, working with a wood supplier who thought he was insane for requesting such specific grain density. He hand-carved a new soundboard using the compression marks from the original as his guide, a process so painstaking that a single miscalculation would render weeks of work useless. He rebuilt the pin block using a lamination technique he developed himself during his years of obscurity, a method no formal training program taught because nobody else had ever thought to try it. The hammers were the hardest part. Leonard had spent decades voicing them by hand, shaping the felt density to produce a tone that was warmer and more resonant than any factory setting. There were no records of his process, no measurements, no instructions, just the faintest impressions left in the original hammer felt, which Garrett studied under magnification for hours, adjusting his own hammer, voicing a fraction of a millimeter at a time until his ear told him it was right. Catherine visited the workshop 4 times during the restoration. The first visit was purely professional. She inspected progress, asked technical questions, and left within an hour. The second visit, she stayed longer, she watched Garrett work in silence for nearly 3 hours, saying almost nothing. The third visit she brought dinner, takeout from a restaurant in Decatur that Garrett later admitted was the best meal he had eaten in years. The fourth visit changed things. She arrived late on a Friday evening without calling ahead. The workshop door was open. Inside, Garrett sat on an overturned milk crate beside the half-restored piano, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed. Sophie was asleep on the old corduroy sofa in the back room, her school backpack still on her shoulder, a book open on her chest. The overhead light was off. The only illumination came from a clip-on work lamp attached to the piano frame, casting warm shadows across the scattered tools, wood shavings, and coffee cups that covered every surface. Catherine stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. She later told a journalist it was the first moment of genuine peace she had experienced since her father's death. The two of them began talking that night. Not about the piano. About loss. About the strange way grief rearranges your life without asking permission. Catherine told Garrett about the guilt she carried, that she had been in London when her father died, attending a fundraiser she did not even want to go to. That she spent years wondering if she preserved his legacy out of love or obligation. That some morning she woke up and could not remember the sound of his voice, and the terror of that forgetting was worse than anything she had ever experienced. Garrett listened the way he listened to damaged instruments, carefully, without rushing toward a diagnosis. When she finished, he told her about Diane. About the 11 months in the hospital room. About the silence afterward that was so total it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. About the night he almost gave up entirely, sitting alone in his workshop at 2 a.m, and how the only thing that stopped him was the sound of Sophie turning over in her sleep in the next room. They sat in that workshop until almost 1 a.m. Neither of them reached for the other. Neither of them needed to. Something had already shifted. As the restoration entered its final weeks, word began to leak through the music industry. A small-town repairman in Illinois was attempting what every expert in the world had declared impossible. Reactions ranged from amusement to outright hostility. A prominent piano restoration firm in New York published a blog post calling the project irresponsible and accusing Catherine of endangering a historically significant instrument by entrusting it to an unqualified amateur. Philip, Catherine's advisor, forwarded the article to her with a single line of commentary. "I told you so." Catherine deleted the email without responding. Garrett ignored all of it. He had spent a decade being invisible. Criticism from people who had never set foot in his workshop meant nothing compared to the sound he was chasing inside that piano. The unveiling was scheduled during the annual Leonard Aldridge Memorial Concert at Hargrove Hall. Catherine made the decision deliberately. If the restoration failed, it would fail publicly, in front of 1,200 people, dozens of journalists, and every competitor who predicted exactly that outcome. Philip called it professional suicide. Catherine called it faith. The night before the concert, Garrett sat alone in the empty hall with the restored piano under a black drape on the stage. Sophie was asleep at the hotel. The cleaning crew had gone home. The only sound was the building's ventilation system humming softly through the walls. He pulled back the drape and looked at the instrument. The cabinet gleamed under the stage lights. The mahogany was darker than the original, a consequence of the replacement wood's slightly different aging. But the curves, the proportions, the subtle design elements Leonard had built into the body were all there. Every one of them recovered from burn marks and structural damage that should have erased them permanently. Garrett sat down on the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and played a single chord. The sound that filled Hargrove Hall in that empty moment was unlike anything he had ever heard from an instrument he restored. It was warm but not soft, clear but not thin. It had a depth that seemed to come from somewhere below the strings, as if the piano itself was remembering something it had been taught a long time ago. Garrett sat there for a long time after the sound faded. Then he covered the piano, turned off the stage lights, and went back to the hotel to sleep beside his daughter. The next evening, Hargrove Hall was packed. Journalists lined the walls. Foundation donors filled the first 10 rows. Philip sat in the back with his arms crossed, already composing the apologetic press release he was sure he would need by morning. Catherine stood at the podium and spoke briefly about her father. She did not mention the fire or the restoration. She did not introduce Garrett. She simply said that her father believed music had the power to find its way back to the people who needed it, no matter how far it had traveled or how much damage it had sustained along the way. Then, the curtain rose. The piano sat alone under a single white spotlight. For a moment, nobody moved. The audience recognized the shape immediately. The distinctive curves of Leonard Aldridge's legendary Steinway, the instrument most of them believed had been destroyed 7 months earlier. Then the concert pianist Catherine had selected, a young woman from Baltimore, who grew up in the same kind of community Leonard spent his final years performing for, sat down and began to play. The first note landed like a stone dropped into still water. By the fourth measure, people in the front rows were leaning forward in their seats. By the end of the first movement, 3 audience members were openly crying. The sound was not identical to Leonard's recordings. It was not supposed to be, but it carried something unmistakable, a warmth, a resonance, a quality that music critics later struggled to describe using technical language because it was not technical. It was emotional. It was the sound of someone who loved an instrument so deeply that the love became part of the instrument itself. And Garrett had found it, preserved it, and given it back. When the final note faded into silence, the audience sat motionless for nearly 5 seconds. Then the applause began. It started slowly from the back of the hall and built like a wave until every person in the room was standing. Journalists who came expecting failure scrambled to rewrite their stories. Philip uncrossed his arms and stared at the stage with an expression that was not quite shame but was certainly close. And standing in the wings, just off stage behind the heavy velvet curtain, Garrett Hollis held his daughter's hand and listened to 1,200 people applauding something he built in a workshop with no sign on the door. But the moment that mattered most came 30 minutes later. After the audience filed out and the cameras were turned off, Catherine found Garrett sitting alone in the 4th row of the empty hall, looking at the piano on the stage the way someone looks at a letter they have been meaning to send for years. She sat down beside him and told him what she had not told anyone yet. During the restoration, she had commissioned an independent acoustic analysis comparing the restored piano's tonal signature to archival recordings of Leonard playing the original instrument. The results, which she received that morning, confirmed something remarkable. Garrett had not simply rebuilt the piano. He had resolved a tonal imbalance in the upper register that Leonard himself had struggled with for decades, a slight brightness in the treble that Leonard once described in a private letter as the one conversation with this instrument I never finished. Garrett finished it. He did not know about the letter. He did not know Leonard considered it a flaw. He simply heard something that was not right and fixed it, the way he had fixed broken things his entire life. Quietly, without recognition because the work itself demanded it, Catherine told him she wanted to establish a new division within the Aldridge Foundation dedicated to instrument restoration and music education in rural communities, a program that would send master restorers into small towns to save instruments that schools and churches could not afford to repair. She wanted Garrett to lead it. She wanted the program named after both Leonard Aldridge and Diane Hollis. Garrett did not speak for a long time. Sophie, sitting 2 rows behind them with her legs tucked beneath her on the velvet seat, watched her father's shoulders shake once, then still. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. He said he would need to be home by 3:15 on school days. Catherine laughed. It was the first time Garrett had heard her laugh, and the sound reminded him of a tuning fork struck cleanly, bright, clear, and resonant, in a way that lingered long after it should have faded. Later that night, as Garrett and Sophie drove west on the Pennsylvania Turnpike with the dashboard lights casting a faint green glow across their faces, Sophie asked her father if he thought the piano sounded the way it was supposed to. Garrett thought about the question for a long time, then he said it sounded the way it wanted to. That sometimes when something has been broken badly enough, you cannot put it back exactly the way it was. But if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to what the broken thing is trying to tell you, you can help it become something new, something that carries everything it used to be but is no longer afraid of what it went through. Sophie nodded slowly in the passenger seat, her reflection floating in the dark window glass against the passing highway lights. She asked if he was still talking about the piano. Garrett smiled for the first time in a long time and did not answer. But they both knew. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear that broken does not mean finished. And subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories that remind us the most extraordinary things in this world are almost always built by the most ordinary hands. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the only ones quiet enough to hear what still needs saving.